On December 19, 2001, the body of 4-year-old Zachary Longo was found in Lint Slough, Oregon, when it washed up on the shore of the Alsea River. Zachary had been drowned to death, as had his sister, 3-year-old Sadie, who was found a mile offshore in the Pacific Ocean. His mother, younger sister Madison, and his father, Christian Longo, were nowhere to be found. Today, we're going to unpack the twisted story of the Longo family, a family that was bound together by religious conviction, and that was ended brutally by a narcissist who could, quite literally, only think of himself. Christian Longo was born Christian Michael Stewart on January 23, 1974, to Joy and Stephen Stewart. He spent the first 4 years of his life in Iowa, where he was constantly terrorized by his alcoholic father. The abuse extended to Joy as well, who was just a teenager by the time her first son was born. She eventually had another son with Stephen, whom she named Dustin. This might have made things even worse in the already tense household, with Stephen's violent rage making Joy feel unsafe in her own home. Ultimately, she decided to leave him and got a job at Target to support herself and the kids. Life as a single mother couldn't have been easy for her, but things started to get better when she met a man named Joe Longo. They both worked at Target, and Joe seemed to take an instant liking to the kids. Not long after, he proposed to Joy and adopted Christian and Dustin as his own. Things got quiet for a time after that. Joe was promoted to district manager, and Joy was able to spend more time with her children. But during the years that her oldest son had spent by himself, either hiding from his abusive father or waiting for his mother to come home from her full-time job, something festered inside Christian Longo's mind. He came to be obsessed with appearances, insisting that people only ever see the best side of him. And if he didn't really have anything good to show the world, he wasn't afraid to lie and cheat his way to getting those status symbols he'd always desired. A major change came to the Longo household when Joy received a visit from Jehovah's Witnesses. Up until that point, she'd been a lapsed Catholic with no intention of going back to church, and she'd raised her boys accordingly as well. However, something about the message brought to her by these door-to-door proselytizers resonated with her, and she decided to become a Jehovah's Witness herself. Joe seemed to be all for embracing religion, and pretty soon the kids were being taught to live according to the ways of Jehovah's Witnesses as well. Part of this meant that they couldn't really associate with non-Jehovah's Witnesses, something that may have increased the sense of isolation that Longo felt from the outside world. But at the same time, Longo found himself entranced by the charismatic way of speaking he witnessed at the Jehovah's Witness gatherings he attended. It's possible that this inspired his ability to instantly switch on the charm later on in life, an ability that would get him into more trouble than you could imagine, and put him on a path that would lead to unspeakable violence. For now, though, Christian Longo was just a regular teenager, or at least seemed like one, and just like any teen, he wanted to start dating. Unfortunately, his parents made this pretty difficult for him. Mary Jane Baker was born on April 25, 1967, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Unlike her future husband, she came from a big family, although the couple would eventually bond over being the children of divorced parents. Jim and Susan Baker divorced in 1973, when Mary Jane was 7 years old, a split that was potentially caused by Susan's sudden conversion to Jehovah's Witness. Jim apparently didn't agree with this new religious lifestyle, and the couple parted ways. Mary Jane decided to follow her mother into the Jehovah's Witness way of life, and by the early 90s, she was working as a secretary at the dental school at the University of Michigan. There weren't that many Jehovah's Witnesses, at least back then. It was a very tightly knit community, and as a result, the arrival of a new Jehovah's Witness family was a bit of an event. That's exactly what happened when the Longos moved to nearby Ypsilanti, Michigan in 1990. Joe had just gotten promoted to regional manager, which meant moving all the way from Iowa to Michigan. The family quickly integrated into the local community and attended Kingdom Hall meetings as often as they could. It was at one of these meetings that Mary Jane met Christian and started to fall for him. By the time Christian met Mary Jane, he'd become more isolated than ever before. The conversion to Jehovah's Witness had greatly limited his social circle, and moving to a different state meant that any friends he'd had since childhood had been left behind. To make things worse, Christian wasn't even going to school like other teenagers, since his parents preferred to homeschool him to keep him away from the rest of the world's corrupting influence. It bears mentioning that Mary Jane was 25 years old when she met Christian, who was 18 years old at the time. Despite the age gap, the two felt like they were meant to be together. Mary Jane had been wanting to get married for years, but she just hadn't been able to find the right man. The fact that she could only marry a Jehovah's Witness considerably narrowed down her pool of candidates. But with Christian, she found someone that she could genuinely enjoy her life with without having to marry outside of her religious group. There was only one problem. Christian's parents were completely against the relationship. They felt like Christian was too young to be dating, and not because Mary Jane was older than him. They didn't want him dating anyone his own age either. They eventually gave him an ultimatum. Either Christian could choose to continue living with them, or he could date Mary Jane, in which case he'd have to move out. Either it was a form of control, or they genuinely felt like their oldest son wasn't mature enough to be in a relationship, and if that were the case, they would have been right. Christian knew nothing about the world. He worked part-time while living at home and had no college credentials to his name. Life could have been very difficult indeed for Christian, but he was nothing if not industrious. At first, he lived with his friends until he finally found a place for himself with some roommates. But he knew that he had to do something big to impress Mary Jane, which happened to be the factor that made him take his first step into a life of crime. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Christian and Mary Jane were in New York for a Jehovah's Witness trip when he finally popped the big question. He gave her a dazzling diamond ring when asking for her hand in marriage, a ring so glamorous that one might wonder how he bought it while working just a part-time job. The answer was that he'd bought the ring on credit, and he had no way of paying the jeweler for it. This would turn out to be a pattern in Christian's life. His expenses always exceeded his income, no matter how much he happened to bring in. But with that said, he seemed to have a knack for paying his debts in the beginning, although his means of obtaining that money was completely illegal. The first criminal incident he was involved in was directly linked to the engagement ring he'd given Mary Jane. He was working at a camera shop at the time, and one day a customer showed up and paid a $108 deposit for a new camera. Christian pocketed the entire amount and used it to partially pay for the diamond ring he'd bought. Why would an 18-year-old put himself in this position? Mary Jane certainly never asked for a diamond ring, or at least there are no reports of her being overly materialistic like that. On the contrary, she may have been fine with a simple promise ring, or some other symbol of their devotion to each other that didn't involve Christian stealing from his employer. But the deed was already done, and it sent Christian Longo hurtling into a decades-long crime spree that he'd be running from for the rest of his life. When Longo stole that money, it didn't take long for the shop's manager to find out. Longo tried to escape justice by quitting his job, but he was eventually caught and convicted of misdemeanor embezzlement, for which he was sentenced to 80 hours of community service. He confessed to Mary Jane about the conviction, but she decided to stick by him. He mattered more to her than anyone else in the world, and she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. Even the fact that they were barred from hosting their wedding in the local Kingdom Hall didn't dissuade Mary Jane from marrying Longo. Mary Jane Baker became Mary Jane Longo on March 13, 1993. Despite everything that had happened, Joe and Joy wanted to make sure that their son and new daughter-in-law would have a nice honeymoon, so they decided to pay for them to go to Jamaica. When the newlyweds came back, Longo got a job delivering newspapers, but often told people that he actually worked for the New York Times. It was part of a trend of self-aggrandizement that he'd never really get over. He had to make sure people saw him as someone impressive, and seemingly had no concerns about being caught as a liar. And yet, no one really caught Longo, at least not for a few years. He had 3 children with Mary Jane, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison in 1997, 1998, and 1999, respectively. It seems that his criminal inclinations hit a whole new level during this tumultuous time period. Longo ended up quitting his job right in the middle of expanding his family and took up a much lower-paying job at a company that sold fireplaces and spas. He claimed this was because he wanted to spend more time with his family, but he didn't seem to factor in the reduced income. Him and Mary Jane continued spending far beyond their means, buying luxury cars and even a jet ski, all while their new children brought the prospect of massive expenses down the line. And on top of all of that, the Longos kept taking financial hits from every direction. Madison's birth brought several complications along with it. She was born premature and had to stay in the hospital for a month to recover. Since their insurance didn't cover the extended hospital stay, the Longos ended up having one of their cars repossessed. There's a chance that this sudden debt pushed Longo off the edge, because about a year and a half later, his entire family would end up dead. At the turn of the millennium, Longo founded Final Touch Construction Cleaning, a company that he'd conduct massive fraud through over the next year. This may have been an attempt at regaining the financial status he'd lost after the massive medical debt he had to pay back, something that also resulted in Mary Jane's car getting repossessed. The fact that his neighbors had seen one of his cars getting towed likely gnawed at Longo's pride. He had to control the narrative however he could, and show people that he could get his wife a car whenever he wanted to. He accomplished this by creating a fake driver's license. One of the things that Longo had splurged on was a computer, scanner, and printer, all of which were quite rare back then. He used these to print a fake driver's license with the name Jason Fortner, and after getting it laminated, he headed to a nearby car dealership. Mary Jane had told him about wanting a minivan that could fit the whole family, and that's exactly the car that Longo set his sights on. He gave the person at the front desk the fake ID to photocopy, got into the car for a test drive, and never came back. His other vehicle had a vanity license plate which was registered to his name but not to a specific vehicle. So he simply swapped out the plates and was able to get away pretty much scot-free. By early 2001, Longo was in trouble with pretty much everyone. He'd written back checks, failed to pay workers' comp to an injured employee, and even defrauded his own parents by forging Joe's signature on a credit card. He had lawsuits and potential criminal charges to deal with. But while all of this was going on, Longo also did something that would completely shut him off from the Jehovah's Witness community. He had an affair. It's unclear if this was an emotional affair or a physical one, but it didn't matter. He was disfellowshipped from the Jehovah's Witnesses, and his parents stopped talking to him. Mary continued attending church, but she had to do so without her husband, something that would have been a source of great shame for her. With the walls closing in, Longo decided to make a run for it. He packed up and moved to Toledo, Ohio, where he rented a warehouse with plans to start a new business. He swore to Mary Jane that he'd be good this time. He had a knack for manipulation, and he used it to convince the landlord of the warehouse to accept just 1 month's rent as a deposit, skipping a credit check entirely. It wasn't the first time Longo had charmed his way into an agreement, and it wouldn't be the last. Once he had the space, Longo wasted no time diving into his next scheme. Using a freshly opened bank account, he began cashing forged checks in the names of other builders he'd worked for. It was bold, almost brazen, and Longo didn't even bother to hide his identity while pulling it off. Instead, he leaned into his charisma, acting as though he had nothing to hide. That confidence carried him far, but it was only a matter of time before his schemes unraveled. At the warehouse, he set up a new business, one that revolved around selling stolen goods. His boldest move yet? Listing a skid loader worth $30,000 for just $5,000 in a local ad. It didn't take long for this to raise suspicions. This led to Sergeant Paul Hickey coming to inspect the warehouse after receiving reports of something shady. But even here, Longo's charm proved powerful. He misled Hickey with excuses and a polished demeanor, and the sergeant left without taking further action. Hickey's instincts, however, wouldn't let the situation go. When he dug deeper, he discovered the skid loader was stolen, though the theft hadn't been reported at the time. This led to a full investigation of the warehouse, and the findings were damning. A stolen trailer, a boat, and another trailer. By the time the police pieced it all together, the Longos had vanished, leaving chaos in their wake. The Longo family didn't stay in one place for long. They traveled across the country, camping out and living off money from Longo's endless string of scams. When they finally settled down in Yakuts, Oregon, they rented a home with cash, explaining their inability to use credit cards by claiming the cards were maxed out. It was a believable excuse, one that likely drew sympathy from their new landlord. But the story didn't hold up for long. Unable to afford the rental home, the Longos eventually moved into a motel in Newport, Oregon, a further step down in their precarious situation. For a brief moment, Longo tried to maintain the appearance of a respectable life. He landed a part-time job at Starbucks, relying on his charm to secure the position despite having no prior experience. He even managed to snag a promotion to full-time, all while spinning an elaborate lie about working for Quest Communications to bolster his image. As if that wasn't enough, he went on to rent a condo in Newport, despite having no realistic way to pay for it. That's when he decided to end things with his family once and for all. Chris felt that his life would be much easier if he didn't have a family to take care of. In November of 2001, he decided to kill them. He began with Mary Jane, who he strangled her in cold blood, along with their 2-year-old daughter, Madison. He stuffed their bodies into suitcases and discarded them in the water, but the horror didn't stop there. With his wife and youngest child already gone, Longo took his remaining children, 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie, 3, to a nearby bridge. He tied weighted pillowcases to their ankles, threw them into the water while they were still alive. After murdering his entire family, Longo did what he always did, moved forward as though nothing had happened. He stole a Dodge Durango from a car dealership by driving it straight out of the showroom. Then, astonishingly, he returned to work at Starbucks for 2 more shifts. The lies flowed as easily as ever. He told friends and his landlord that Mary Jane had left him, taking the kids to the airport. For a time, he kept the horrific truth hidden behind his usual charm and deceit. The truth, however, was already beginning to surface. On December 19th, Zachary's body was found in the water. A friend of the Longos recognized him from a drawing released by the news, leading police to make the connection. A dive search uncovered a pillowcase filled with rocks, a grim confirmation of how the children were killed. Days later, 2 housekeepers found items in a dumpster behind the motel where the Longos had stayed. Baby books, Mary Jane's driver's license, children's clothes, undeveloped film. Each discovery a breadcrumb on the trail of destruction Chris Longo had left behind. On December 27th, divers found the suitcases containing Mary Jane and Madison beneath the Embarcadero Marina. Both had been strangled. As the net tightened, Longo fled. He cashed a paycheck, left Newport, and headed south to Cancun, Mexico, where he adopted a new identity, Michael Finkel, a real New York Times journalist. He stayed in a hostel, charmed a German photojournalist named Janina, and even collaborated with her on an article about Mayan mysticism. For a brief moment, it seemed like he'd found a way to reinvent himself entirely. But his crimes had caught up to him. On January 12, 2002, an episode of America's Most Wanted aired, featuring Longo's story. Tips poured in. Hostel visitors and tour guides in Tulum recognized him, and local police arrested him there. Even in his final moments of freedom, Longo negotiated, demanding immediate extradition to the U.S. to avoid time in a Mexican jail. At his trial, Longo's lies grew even more elaborate. He pleaded guilty to killing Mary Jane and Madison, but claimed Mary Jane had killed the other children, prompting him to retaliate. When Madison showed signs of life, he said he killed her too. His lawyers advised against this defense, but Longo ignored them, as he often ignored advice that didn't serve his ego. The jury wasn't swayed. They convicted him of first-degree murder for Zachary and Sadie and sentenced him to death. So what do you think of this case? Do you believe Christian Longo's actions were fueled purely by narcissism, or was there something deeper at play?